gyda chi, Simon. I'm going to start, I think, with you at the beginning, really, because your passion for food comes through. It radiates. So where did it come from? How did it start?
Well, I don't think I was much different to any other young boy, really. I was a hungry young man, as many of us were. I think probably, again, like lots of us, perhaps from my generation in particular, a lot of my first contact with cooking came from my grandparents. Both my grandmothers were Welsh, from the valleys, and a great tradition of baking and a reverence for food. They took it very seriously. We were expected to take it seriously. Sitting down for a meal was an important occasion. They weren't particularly well off either, so food was reverential in that sense, in that it took a lot of work to be able to put those things on the table. So food was taken seriously in my youth, but I don't suppose I was much different to anybody else in that respect. I think there's one particular moment that I remember very well that really changed. I kind of look as the seed of everything that came afterwards, as far as I was concerned, and ending up with a life in food and making a career out of it, which was I was about 12 years old. I think it was my 12th birthday, and my grandparents decided that they wanted to take me out for a meal as a birthday gift. And I'd never been to a restaurant before. And there weren't that, this has been 1975, so there weren't that many restaurants around, and certainly not of any quality. This was a pub, really. It was unusual for the time. It was a pub restaurant, the sort that we see lots these days. And I remember going there and just falling in love with the whole thing, the whole theatre of it. The fact that somebody gave me a menu to choose food from, the fact that you were being waited upon, the richness of the dishes, just the sense of occasion, really. And I think from that moment, in a sense, I was as in love with restaurants as I was with food. It's actually rather odd, because I remember, you look back on things and you have a kind of romantic view of them, and I've always kind of looked back on that and thought, my God, I had this fantastic meal. And I remember having the coq au vin, and I remember the little baby onions, the lardon, the very rich red wine sauce. And when my grandmother died a few years ago, I actually mentioned this when I was talking at her funeral, and I said that, I had to thank her for my love of food on this particular occasion. And afterwards, when we were at the wake, a woman came up to me and she said, "You probably won't remember me." She said, "But I'm a distant cousin of yours, and I was actually the restaurant manager that night that you were in the ship in, having that food." And she said, "That coq au vin that you talked about." And I said, "Oh yeah, that coq au vin." And she said, "Yeah, it was boiled in the bag." So
you don't do that, do you?
No, in a sense it doesn't matter. It was delicious at the time.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Right, I remember Wales, back in those days, being described as a gastronomic desert. And I think that was probably true.
Yeah.
We've come a long way, I think, don't you?
Oh, yeah, a really long way. I think it was, we've been described that way many times. A.A. Gill has made particular mention of it, and still does, I think. But, yeah, things have changed hugely. I think it's fair to say that they've changed in the whole of the United Kingdom as well. The last 20 or 30 years has seen much more interest, or a revival of interest in food, and in particular in eating out. I think you have to kind of probably distinguish in our food culture, though, between our eating out culture, which has developed. I think there are better places to eat now than there ever have been. Long way to go. We could do with some more, but that's developed hugely. In terms of our food culture as a whole, though, I wouldn't say that's necessarily developed at all. And in fact, well, I think that when you look at the way that our children are eating, in particular, the respect that we give food, the lack of occasion that it's great here today. I just think it's fantastic that we've all got a cup of tea and a waffle. It's fantastic. I think that's deteriorated, and when we look at the issues that we face in Wales with dietary related diseases, for instance, obesity, type 2 diabetes, we're kind of leading the league tables in those things. So on the one hand, I think we have developed, well, another thing that we've developed is we're very good at kind of selling our wonderful produce now. We've come to recognise how good it is. We've got lots of small producers out there doing wonderful things, particularly in the realms of cheese, for instance. And then we look at our eating out places, they've improved too. But when you look at the overall food culture, there's a lot to be worried about, I think.
I think you strike something quite pertinent there, because we do produce some of the best meats, cheeses, fish, but do we serve it well?
Well, not as well as we
think
might.
Of our lamb, for example.
Yeah, lamb's a good. We had this conversation the other day, didn't we? I mean, lamb is a really good example because we look at how much beautiful lamb we produce in this area. But somebody asked me the other day, where can I go for a really good Sunday lunch? Now, I'm sure, hopefully, you'll all have your favourite places, but I think the reality of it is it's not that easy to go out and get a really good Sunday roast, and lamb being a feature of that. And that disappoints me, because these are quite simple things to do. I mean, it's not that difficult to get it right, and I'd love to see more of that. I mean, I don't. To be honest, I don't know about you, but if I'm thinking about where to go and have some Sunday lunch, I'm struggling, to be honest.
And I'm struggling to get good gravy.
Yes.
I do not want Sunday lunch with a jus. I want it to have proper gravy. Anybody can do a jus.
Yeah. No, I think that's it, and I think that's another thing that we need to kind of perhaps come back to is the simplicity of good food. I mean, good food isn't about what we see on Great British Menu or MasterChef and all this complicated cooking and these weird and wacky ideas, and it's all a lot of fun to watch that on television, and sometimes it's fun to experience it, but the reality of good food is that it's about paying respect to the basic ingredients, cooking them sympathetically, often in the way that they've been cooked for a very long time, because those combinations of flavours work really well. And they're cliched, and the reason they're cliches is because they work, and just getting the basics right. I mean, you take a roast dinner, there's a world of difference between one roast dinner and another. I mean, a roast dinner can be the most magnificent thing to eat, as good as any restaurant, 3-star restaurant meal, but it also can be an appalling mess, and too often it's the latter. So I think it's about simplicity. It's very difficult to persuade chefs of that. That's one of the problems that you have. I worked on Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, the UK version, not the hysterical American version, or the more hysterical American version. And one of the things that my job was to kind of go and look at these restaurants before Gordon did, and write a little report for him about what we might do and how we might put it right and what was wrong with it. And one of the reasons I think the British series came to an end is that the stories were always the same, because we were always telling people to simplify things, to actually do, telling chefs to do the simple things well, and to go back to that. And there's a lot of chefs out there that haven't even mastered those things. I mean, they can't do it anyway, and it's a question of putting the cart before the horse. They think about presentation and about innovation and bright new ideas when they actually probably can't do scrambled egg properly. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that Gordon always used to say, that and I think they still do it in his restaurants. If they're employing someone, the first thing they have to do is go and make scrambled eggs.
Is it intrinsic in chefs that they want to show off anyway?
Yeah, I think it is, and in a way, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just when it's misplaced. I mean, the guys and girls that are really good, the people that we should really admire, are those ones who've put their training in. And we had a meal at Wright's last night, and there was a chef called Ian Bennett who was the chef at a place called Welcome to Town in Llanryddion in the Gower, and he's about to open at the most unbelievable venue, the Coal House in Oxwich Bay, and he came and cooked 8 courses last night. None of it was groundbreaking, none of it was a revelation, but everything was perfectly cooked. So when we had an egg custard tart at the end, it was just nice and wobbly, the flavour was great, the pastry was fantastic, and that's what I hope to see. Yeah, the skill, that's the difference. It's the difference between doing something okay and doing it really, really well.
Yeah. So when you were a critic, did they clock you?
They did, yeah. And I mean, it was easy. It's easier when you're in a restaurant in a large city and there's lots of lone diners, and they're not so unused to somebody coming in their own. When you're in a country house hotel in the Cotswolds, you stick out like a sore thumb. And of course, if they don't know who you are, they think you're either from the AA, which is what I was, or Michelin, or the Good Food Guide, and then they start to flock around you. You know, it's difficult. I mean, a lot of the time, you know, there'd be a healthy relationship, and you know, they kind of just ignore the fact, but on the other hand, you would get these occasions on which I used to get brought lots of extra bad food. That was as if that was going to help, you know. So, because actually, even if they do know who, you can't suddenly become a great cook just because you know someone's out there inspecting. You can give them extra attention. You can pay a little bit more attention to it. You can take a bit more care over it. But the reality is that fundamentally, you can either cook or you can't. And I have been in those situations where, and they do get panicky as well, understandably. I mean, you know, I've been on the other side of it as well. So, you know, I understood all that. But
did you go through it scientifically? Did you have columns, sort of 5 out of 10 for presentation, 6 out of 10 for content, or that kind of stuff?
Well, one thing, we had 30 inspectors with the AA, and at the time that I left, I was the editor, so I had 30 inspectors working for me. And it was very important that we had some kind of benchmarking as best you could, because people think that, how can you be a food critic? Because it's subjective. I mean, you go out, some people like this, some people like that. But actually what you're trying to do there is make something as subjective, as objective as you possibly can. And the way that we did that was we would break it down into... And we started, I could, very briefly, it's what makes good food. That was what we were looking for. And the first thing that every inspector had to look for was the quality of the ingredients. So what was being put on the plate. So that was the fundamental thing. Before anything else, what is the quality of the ingredients that are put before you? The second thing, are those things accurately cooked and sympathetically cooked? So if you've got a piece of fish, is it overcooked, is it undercooked, or is it perfect, and is it properly seasoned? So, you know, fundamental thing. Then, do the things that are on the plate work together? So if you've got a piece of fish and there's a sauce with it and something else, do those three things complement each other as a dish? Now, by now, you've eliminated 95% of restaurants in the UK. So you know, I liked the fact that we concentrated on those fundamental things, and it was only at that point that you start to think about, is there some imagination, is there some innovation here, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, you try and make it as scientific as you can, but also, I mean, we never did anything to draw attention to ourselves, so you would not write notes. I mean, I had a good food guide inspector come into the Pollen, and he wrote notes throughout the meal. And I just thought that was really unprofessional, because it puts everybody on their guard, you know. You're kind of thinking, what's he writing? You know, you want to try and have a look. You know. The best visit we had, though, was we had Jay Rayner came to inspect us at the Pollen. Yeah. And I didn't know Jay Rayner at the time. And I was away doing kitchen nightmares somewhere in England. And I was driving back, and I think I got as far as the Bristol on the M4. And I had a text from Mark, a partner in the restaurant, and Mark had, and I couldn't read it because I was driving. I pulled in at the services, and it said, "Oh, expletive, Jay Rayner's just walked in," and that was about an hour before I read it. You know, so, my God, Jay Rayner is the food critic, the Observer. Wasn't quite as well known as he is now, but you know, significant figure.
Claire Rayner's son.
Claire Rayner's son, yeah. So I got back to the Pollen about 2 hours later, and he was just leaving, and I exchanged some pleasantries with him, and off he went. And I said to Mark, "What happened? You know, how was it? Was it good? You know, did he see me?" He said he seemed fairly happy. And I said, "Well, what happened when he came in?" He said, "Well, he came in and he said, I've got a table for two booked in the name of James, but there's only me. Is that a problem?" And I said, "Well, what did you say?" And Mark said, "Well," I said, "No, that's not a problem, but there is a problem." And Jay Rayner said, "Well, what's that?" And Mark said, "Your name's not James." So because he recognised him, so they got over that hump at an early stage there, and I mean, it was probably what I was due, which was to sit on the other side of it and have to wait for, I think it was about 5 weeks before that was actually featured in the Observer, with no hint of what the review was going to be. And then, you know, I remember driving to the garage at White Mill when it opened at 6:30 in the morning, picking up the Observer, just almost shaking, because you know, this is a national newspaper. It's a big deal, you know. And actually, he was lovely, fortunately.
I'm sure he was. But you seem to have the Midas touch when you open a food establishment. What is it? Because I can imagine some people would have opened in the Pollen, or even at Wright's in Antgaredig, and people would never find them.
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, I don't think I've got the Midas. I mean, Midas suggests making money, doesn't it? I haven't worked that bit out yet. But we have managed...
It's an analogy.
We have managed to keep things going, and yeah, I'm quite proud of that. I think that we have a very simple view about the restaurant trade, really, which is that we try and do the simple things well. You can't please everybody. We try and please ourselves, be proud of the quality of things that we put out, and we hope that enough people like it to make that sustainable for us. And we do it out of passion rather than any other kind of motivation, to be honest. You know, we like doing it, and I hope that kind of shows, really. I mean, it's a very difficult trade. I mean, most people don't make it, and they do tend to make the same mistakes, which is overstretch themselves, unrealistic about what they think they can charge, and the number of people that are going to come through the door. They don't think hard enough about what their local market is. That was something, again, on Kitchen Nightmares. We saw that all the time. We saw people people will set up a restaurant, think it's a jolly good idea. I've got a few grand in the bank. We'll buy a pub or take a lease on it, and we'll do whatever's, you know, their dream fantasy idea of a restaurant. But the reality is, you have to have the punters come through the door. So if you're not serving what they want, then you've got no chance.
Talking about dreams. If you were in a condemned cell, thank goodness we haven't got those anymore, but if you were cast on a desert island, what would your final meal be on dry land?
Oh, God, you know, I should have thought about that question
Yes.
many times, really, haven't I? I think that...
Depends on the time of year, I suppose.
Yeah, it would depend on the time of year. I mean, I think it would be something... I think that's very pertinent, actually, because I think it's about those very simple seasonal things that I get excited about every year. So, you know, eventually we'll get some asparagus if the weather changes. That'll be the next thing. You know, suin is just... I think I'd find it hard to beat, actually, a piece of suin. I think, you know, that first piece of the year, again, if it's perfectly cooked, I mean, that's when it becomes a real crime, doesn't it? When you've got a lovely suin and someone overcooks it, it's just, you know. But yeah, I think suin would probably, and lamb actually as well. I'm a big fan of lamb. It very simple food, really. I mean, when I got the job as editor of the AA Restaurant Guide, I was asked that question about, well, a similar question: what's the best meal you've ever had? And I said, well, it was, and it came to me straight away. I was in a vineyard. We were staying as guests of somebody in a vineyard near Bordeaux, and the bloke who owned the vineyard, they'd just finished harvesting the grapes of Vendage, and he said, I'm going to invite you for a meal in our little outhouse. And he cooked duck breasts over old vines, with some chips that had been cooked in duck fat, a green salad from his garden, with a vinaigrette made with his own wine vinegar. And to be honest, it was absolutely simple, but it was the best food I ever ate. At the same time, I also ate Marco Pierre White's food when he was cooking at 3-star level in Hyde Park Hotel and in the Oak Room at the Meridian. And, you know, those meals were absolutely incredible. And at the time, I remember saying, that is the best food I've ever eaten. But the reality of it is, if I couldn't eat that again, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. If I couldn't have a very simple roast lamb or great piece of steak with a béarnaise sauce, then I would lose sleep over it. Yeah.
I've got loads more questions I'd like to ask you, but there's so many people here today. I'm sure you're eager to ask Simon some questions yourself. Please, who's going to be first? Yeah.
I've actually asked this before, but I think it's lovely to be quite quick. So, do you know why then, for Abergavenny, the area is very, very foodie? You've got the walnut tree, you've got the hardwick, etc. And you've got the town obviously have invested in it because of the food festival, so that people go there. Do you think that could happen in Carmarthen? I mean, because it seems it could happen, but obviously, do you think it would be a good place to do that?
I think it could, and I think sometimes it's about, having the right people and the right ambition and thinking you can do it. I mean, we're lucky in that we have got really lovely customers who follow us from place to place, but nevertheless, I mean, what we're doing at the moment, we're in Nantgaredig, we've been there a year at the end of this month. It's only open until 7 o'clock. It's a cafe and delicatessen in the middle of nowhere, really nowhere, but it's not in the centre of population. And yet it's sustainable, and at times it's at times it's very busy. So I think it shows that I hope it's quality. I don't make any great claims for it, but quality will attract people. And I think in Carmarthenshire, there's no reason why we couldn't see a greater number of good places to eat. Personally, I never see that as competition either. I think that that kind of growth and quality tends to bring in people more than anything else. It certainly happened in Monmouthshire and Abergavenny and around that area. Yeah. And we have got some good places. There are lots of things that mitigate against us having more good restaurants, not just in Carmarthenshire, but in the whole of the UK. People talk about the UK as if there's been this massive food revolution. It's really, it has happened, but it's mostly concentrated in London. Outside of London, whether it's Wales or Yorkshire or the Southwest, you have to pick out your places and you have to drive to them. There's not loads and loads of good places to eat. And there are a couple of reasons to that. One is we don't have the personnel. There's actually a shortage of really good chefs. It's very difficult. If we wanted to do another place, the biggest problem we would have, restaurant-wise anyway, would be finding chefs. Two, and this sounds like, pity the poor restaurateur, there's not much money in it. But it's true. The margins are actually really, really difficult because in other fields, if you're doing quality, if you go and buy a really good car, a really, really good car, a really ordinary car, let's say, to start with that, you pay X for it. If you go and buy a fantastic car, you'll probably pay 5X for it. You probably pay 5 times as much, a lot more money. In the restaurant trade, it doesn't work like that. If you go to a mediocre pub restaurant, you might spend 20 quid a head. If you go to the Pollen, nothing to do with me now, so I can say that, you'll probably spend 30 quid a head. The difference is not enough to actually motivate people to do it when you look at the extra costs, because the quality of the food that you're buying in is so much more expensive. And we all try and buy local, but it's expensive to do it, but we do it, and you have to try and pass that on as best you can to the customer, but there's a limit to that. And so there are things that that make it difficult for it to happen. And VAT was a bit of a shock going up to 20%, because if you're in the food trade, you can't claim much of that back either. So there are things that mitigate against it, but there's no reason why Carmarthenshire couldn't become like that, and I hope it will.
Well, I think so, because I think the Wrights, for example, and the Pollen captures the spirit, I think, of Carmarthenshire, which is very apt that you're here today. And when we consider what's happening here and what has been happening here this week and last week, fantastic, I think, the whole culture coming together. Rhywun arall? Yeah.
There's one thing that irritates me these days with, you see on MasterChef all the time, you see in some restaurants, the idea of presentation is to create an artwork.
Yeah.
What are the origins of that? Because it doesn't do anything to the food, really.
No, I don't know. I think I'm not sure where the preoccupation came from. I mean, I think some of it's got to do with bourgeois French cooking, you know, and what the way that that's been interpreted in the UK over the years. It's been a bit of a burden to us, actually, French cooking in some ways. Not that French theatricality of service as well. I don't think that we're all that comfortable with it in the UK. That may have had some bearing on the presentation thing. And I just think, in a way, it's easier for a chef to do that than to cook the food properly. Because Sean Hill used to say, Sean Hill is at the Walnut Tree, Sean Hill used to say to me, it takes great confidence to cook simply, because you've got nowhere to hide. There's no wow factor when you put it out on the plate, and it'll look great, but there's no kind of architecture going on, no towers and all that kind of nonsense. And I think that some chefs cover up, in a sense, with that, and I think you're right. It's a great mistake, and I don't like to see it at all. In fact, I know that I think that it's a problem with Great British Menu and with MasterChef that they encourage it. I think that they encourage it because they want to see. They almost want to set people up to fall down again, I suppose. And I don't know. Maybe it doesn't make great television just to be cooking in a more straightforward style. But yeah, I don't get that at all. I hate it, and I will not let anybody in our kitchens do it. I'm, the swoosh of salt
at the back of the spoon.
That's outlawed.
Because there's nothing better sometimes than good fish and good chips.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
I mean, I think this is the point. I mean, you take somewhere like the Ferry Cabin in Ferryside. I don't know if any of you know. What a great place to have fish and chips. I once took a load of Welsh Tourist Board inspectors out training on food, and we took them to a well-known. I'll tell you actually, it was Llangwyd Hall. But not in its Llangwyd Hall's been taken over now, and I don't know what it's like, so don't. But this was about 3 or 4 years ago, and it really was on its knees a bit. But they were still charging those prices, and I took them there for dinner. And the idea was that they would, make an assessment of it. I think it was £45 for 3 courses. There was a lot of presentational bits going on. Hardly anything was seasonal. Cooking was poor. It just wasn't very good at all.
But lots of waiters in uniform.
Lots of waiters in uniform. Yeah. And then the next day I took them to the Ferry Cabin for lunch. And we had, they had 4 or 5 different fish on the board. Some of it was local. There were unusual things that shouldn't be unusual, like dabs, flounder, grey mullet, mackerel, all from, all local. We had this lunch, and then in the afternoon we had a workshop, and I said to them, right, imagine we've got an imaginary restaurant guide. We've got 1 page left. It's a guide to Wales, best places to eat. Which one is going in? Is it Llangwyd Hall, that everybody knows and has got a reputation, or is it this fish and chip shop? And they quite correctly said it's the fish and chip shop, because it doesn't, that food is better than the other food. It's as simple as that. A sandwich can be better than some elaborate dish. Yeah. It's just the truth of it. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, I mean, in Wales, we're lucky enough not to be involved in the pollen anymore, which means that I can go there once a week, get a discount, and I don't have to worry about whether anyone else is enjoying themselves either anymore. So I'm very fond of the pollen. Locally, I like to go to the Cause in Larne. Nick hasn't changed the menu for 20 years, but it's still really, really good.
You wait a bit for it, don't you? Because everything is cooked fresh.
Yeah, you do, and I always warn people before they go. I recommend it, and I always say, this is not a conventional restaurant in any sense, but I really love that. And then, in Abergavenny, the Hardwick, Stephen Terry, Sean Hill, the Walnut Tree. We're lucky to have those people working in Wales, I think. So I really love those places, and. I think there's a few amazing places, ethnic places in Cardiff as well. Purple Poppadom is great, in Cardiff. Anyone's been there, it's really, really good.
But they are ethnic, aren't they? Because people ask me if they're coming from London or whatever, where do I eat in Cardiff?
Cardiff's
it's a very, very difficult question.
Yeah.
What about the potted pig? I've never been there.
I've been a couple of times. It's okay. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I think that you know, it's doing well in Cardiff, but Cardiff hasn't got much to offer, really. But you know, we talk about Cardiff as a big problem. I mean, most cities of Cardiff's size in the UK don't have very many decent restaurants. So I think we're going to see a lot more informal eating out. I think we're going to see places that, you know, are a little bit more like what we're doing in Nantgaredig. I think we'll see those. Well, they already are emerging in London, and I think we may well see that happening in Cardiff. I hope so. Places where, you know, the food, you're paying for the food on the plate, not for the cutlery, the glassware, the crockery, somebody to pour your wine. If you want those things, then you know, that's great. But I think that one of the ways that restaurants are finding to survive now, at least that they're getting back to, they're actually just stripping it to the basics and the essentials.
I don't like anybody pouring my wine anyway, because I like to drink at my own pace.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nonsense, to be honest, but, you know...
Don't push it.
I know, but then we exist in a kind of... There is a kind of strange structure that surrounds all that, of expectation. I mean, you know, it even goes down to, like, the way they award stars with Visit Wales and stuff. You know, hotels will find themselves not at the star rating they want to be if they don't pour the wine. You know, I remember doing some consultancy for a hotel that wanted to get 5 stars with Visit Wales, and they couldn't get it because the waiters weren't presenting the napkin. You know, putting the napkin in. Now, that's to me is, I don't want the waiter to do that. To be honest, it's too intimate.
Yes.
Well, it depends on the waiter or waitress.
I get it. Yes.
I mean, you just started to talk about it, but how does the design and the environment of your restaurants tie into your food philosophy?
Well, I always felt that we should start. I've always felt with our places that you start with the food and you build everything else around it. So you decide kind of what style of food you want to do, and everything else should kind of fit that. And it's difficult to be prescriptive about it, but you kind of get a sense of it, really. I mean, and we tend to go for informality to one degree or another. We're gradually getting more informal all the time, actually. But that's the way that I look at it. So, and if you're lucky to have a building with some character, then you respect the character of that building. I don't believe in, as you will have noticed if you've been to any of our places, saucepans are slightly different example, because I'm only one person there and there's lots of other people making decisions, but generally speaking we tend to the informal, and we don't spend a lot on the building itself because I've never got that much money to spend, to be honest, and I wonder how you're going to get it back. So I always think, you know, let's do this as nicely as we can within the budget that we've got. And we tend to have very little working capital. You know, when we started Apollon, we spent £5,000 on the makeover. It was funny, actually, because in Jay Rayner's review, he did put the place looks like it's had one of those simple but effective makeovers that they do on Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmare.
But it is reflected in the furniture as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah, no, it does work. I mean, I like that. I think the furniture's got character. It's all bits and pieces from here and there. You can spend an awful lot of money on a restaurant. You know, people do. It's another mistake. They go in and spend £100,000 on refurbing a room. Well, you know, you've got to be really confident you're going to get that money back. I was in London last week at there's a new restaurant in London called Balthazar, which is there's a Balthazar in New York, very famous, iconic restaurant in New York, and they've just done one in London, and he opened 5 weeks ago. And it's kitted out as a Paris brasserie. It looks exactly like the New York restaurant. It looks absolutely beautiful. I shudder to think how much it's cost. But he is turning over £280,000 a week there at the moment, so you know, it's a bit of a different story.
What are your thoughts on the pop-up restaurants, which seem to be quite well?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And we kind of do it in rights, because we did it last night, in that we only open in the evening once a month. And we sometimes do it ourselves, and sometimes we have a guest chef. And last night, this Ian Bennett guy came, and he did 8 courses. And when you sit down, you don't know anything that you're going to be served. So there's no choice. I really like it. I think it's a great way of using space, and it'd be good to see some more of it, really.
I was thinking King Street, actually, perhaps something pop up there.
Yeah, I don't think that's not a bad idea at all. I think it's a great idea. It also, you can make it affordable if you do it that way as well. You know, because if you're only open for a few nights, you haven't got the great infrastructure to put around it. You know.
But you are testing the water as well, aren't you? Really?
No, I was just thinking, I hope they're not going to ask for it.
But whoever does it is actually maybe testing the water.
Because clearly in London, it is very, very.
It's very
popular. People just turn up. Don't have to book and second to see on.
I think there's a lot of excitement around it. I think it's great. I think also something that I'm really attracted to at the moment is this no choice thing. You know, it doesn't suit everybody, I know, but I personally would love the idea of just sitting down and being brought food. And not having to think about what it is, and also you tend to get the best out of the people that are making it then, because you know the complication in the kitchen of, as you can imagine, of a menu that's got 8 starters, 8 main courses, 8 puds. You've got 50 people coming in within a 3-hour period. You don't know any of them are going to choose. If you're just concentrating on one menu, it allows you to give it more attention, and you know, I think the results you can see that when you eat it.
But a long menu is suspicious anyway, isn't it?
Oh.
No, they are, because you know, I mean, it's the art, a restaurant's the art of the possible. If you can think of all sorts of great ideas, and we do all the time of things we'd like to do. But the next thing you have to think about is how could we actually do that during service. You know, and so there's even at Wright's, there's certain things we don't do because it's too difficult to do it during service and do it properly. Poached eggs, though we do them actually.